Hey everybody. So we're moving along in Beloved. So for this module, you want to read up to page 256. That's if you have this version. If you're using a different version, the page might be different. You want to read up to and including that last strange chapter that begins, I am beloved and she is mine, and it ends with the phrases, I waited for you, you are mine, you are mine, you are mine. So, a lot happens in this section. So in this week's reading, we first read about that pivotal moment in Setha's life when she kills her child, when school teacher comes from Sweet Home to 124 Bluestone Road. After they have that great feast, remember, and schoolmaster is there, school teacher, I should say, is there to collect his slaves and take them back to Kentucky. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act, slave owners from the South could travel north and bring their escaped slaves back to the plantations. And that's what school teacher is trying to do here. In this beginning of this chapter, this is an example of the free indirect speech or free indirect discourse that we find throughout the novel, except here it's from the slaver's perspective. Now, I know that, this use of free indirect speech can be a little confusing because if it switches perspectives a lot, it can make the novel hard to follow because you're not quite sure whose perspective you're actually looking through. But in the beginning of this chapter, the chapter that begins when the four horsemen came, that's from the perspective of the slaver, from school, perhaps school teacher or one of his men. He comes upon the scene of Setha in the shed with the handsaw and her baby's throat cut. Her two boys, Howard and Bugler, are beaten and lying in the sawdust. And he speaks of them as if they're animals, as if they are animals that were abused and are no longer useful. So after that horrific moment, which is told from the slaver's perspective, oddly enough, it's the only time we get his perspective. Then we read about a Stampede trying to show Paul D the newspaper clipping that shows that Setha really did kill her child. Paul D doesn't believe it. He tries to speak to Setha about it, and in this conversation he has with her, she has a lot of trouble putting it into words. And this is another important element of trauma, and one of its ironies. The traumatized person avoids the subject of the traumatic event. But when they have to explain it and put it into words, it's very difficult because the event was not remembered in any logical way. What the traumatized person does experience are intrusive memories that are also called flashbacks that bring the past suddenly back to life. And very often these memories are fragmented. So we read about Setha trying to piece together what exactly happened in the shed that day. And this is on my page 192, again, in this version. Setha knew that the circle she was making around the room, him, the subject, would remain one. That she could never close in, pin it down for anybody who had to ask. If they didn't get it right off, she could never explain. Because the truth was simple. Not a long, drawn-out record of flowered shifts, tree cages, selfishness, ankle ropes, and wells. Simple. She was squatting in the garden, and when she saw them coming and recognized school teacher's hat, she heard wings. Little hummingbirds stuck their needle beaks right through her headcloth into her hair and beat their wings. And if she thought anything, it was no. No. No, no. No, no, no. Simple. She just flew. After she explains this to Paul D, he tells her that your love is too thick and that she claims more than she should. And this idea of claiming is interesting because it's been brought up before. Baby Suggs, when she is finally free, when Garner takes her over to over the border into Ohio, she claims herself, right? And when she's finally free, she starts preaching, and in her, sermons, she also helps others who escape slavery claim ownership of themselves. So here, Setha is claiming her children. They're hers. They belong to her. And Paul D seems to think that's too much. So, why do you think she did it? Do you agree with Paul D that Setha should remember that she has, and I quote, "You got 2 feet, Setha, not 4." Remember, after Paul D says this, it causes a big rift in their relationship. He said that, and right then a forest sprang up between them, trackless and quiet. Their relationship ends for the rest of this section. So when we begin part 2, this relationship between Paul D and Setha is over for now. We then learn about the past of Stampede, this man who helped ferry Setha over the Ohio River when she was running north. Stampede is struggling to knock on Setha's door because the last time he was there, it was to take out baby Sug's dead body when she passed away. And in this scene, Stampede has a piece of hair that he found on the keel of his boat. And this piece of hair is a very important element, a very moving thing for him. And this is on page 212 and 213 of my version. But he describes how white folks had just tired out baby Suggs, that by the end of her life, all she wanted to do was think about different colors. And him, meaning it tired him out too. 1874 and white folks were still on the loose. Whole towns wiped clean of Negroes. 87 lynchings in 1 year alone in Kentucky. 4 colored schools burned to the ground. Grown men whipped like children. Children whipped like adults. Black women raped by the crew. Property taken, necks broken. He smelled skin, and hot blood. The skin was one thing, but human blood cooked in a lynch fire was a whole other thing. The stench stank up off the pages of the North Star, out of the mouths of witnesses, etched in crooked handwriting and letters delivered by hand, detailed in documents and petitions full of whereas and presented to any legal body who'd read it. It stank. But none of that had worn out his marrow. None of that. It was the ribbon. Tying his flatbed up on the bank of the Licking River, securing it the best he could, he caught sight of something red on its bottom. Reaching for it, he thought it was a cardinal feather stuck to his boat. He tugged, and what came loose in his hand was a red ribbon knotted around a curl of wet woolly hair, clinging still to its bit of scalp. He untied the ribbon and put it in his pocket, dropped the curl into the weeds. On the way home, he stopped, short of breath and dizzy. And so when he got to his house, he was too tired to eat the food his sister had made her. And I'm skipping ahead, and he says, our narrator tells us, so in spite of his exhausted marrow, he kept on through the voices and tried once more to knock at the door of 124. This time, although he couldn't cipher but one word, he believed he knew who spoke them. The people of the broken necks, of fire-cooked blood, and black girls who had lost their ribbons. What a roaring. And so this ribbon is symbolic to Stampede. It's symbolic of the violence that people are forced to suffer. And then I want to point out that the narrative then alternates between Stampede's efforts to knock on the door of 124. And he's very upset that he has to knock because he's the type of guy that usually can just walk right in your house. He's that familiar. He's trying to knock on the door of 124 Bluestone Road. And then that alternates with Setha's experience staying home from work and going ice skating with Beloved and Denver. Setha, in these episodes, is ecstatic. Everything's okay. She seems to believe that Beloved is her baby come back. And so when they get back from ice skating, she goes to get wood for the fire. And this is on my page 214. She crunched around to the back, meaning the back of the house, walking in the snow, crunching in the snow, to the cord piled high with snow. After scraping it clean, she filled her arms with as much dry wood as she could. She even looked straight at the shed, smiling at the thing she would not have to remember now, thinking, she ain't even mad with me. Not a bit. So she's looking at the shed where she cut the baby's throat, right? Where we see her in that, chapter when the 4 horsemen came. But now everything's okay. She's smiling. She's not even worried, believing that the baby isn't even mad at her, not a bit. So Stampede finally does knock on that door, and no one answers. Seth is at work where her performance is beginning to slack. She can't wait to get home to Beloved. She's ecstatic. She remembers a conversation with Hallie back at Sweet Home and taking care of her baby girl. And she says, but I got you, baby, and the boys too. When the signal for the train come, you all was the only ones ready. Meaning the sign for her to escape. So when she returns to her house, she opened the door, walked in, and locked it tight behind her. She's convinced that she's been forgiven all her wrongs toward her dead child, and in turn, she feels like she can leave behind all the pain from Sweet Home. She is so content to just be with Beloved and Denver. Then the narrator describes what Stampede thought of as, and I quote, the undecipherable language clamoring around the house was the mumbling of the black and angry dead, like those black girls who lost their ribbons. That's what I added. That's not what Toni Morrison says. But I think this murmuring that he hears around the house, that's what it comes from. It comes from those painful, repressed memories that are, coming out unexpectedly. And I think that is also related to who Beloved is, because right after this section, when he's thinking about that undecipherable language, it begins with those chapters that describe Beloved and their relationship with Beloved. So if Beloved is the baby ghost come back from the dead, which seems to be what Setha thinks, then this also refers to Beloved. This undecipherable language clamoring around the house was the mumbling of the black and angry dead. So when the narrative ends this section with the phrases, when Setha locked the door, the women inside were free at last to be what they liked, see whatever they saw, and say whatever was on their minds. Almost. Mixed in with the voices surrounding the house, recognizable but undecipherable to Stampede, were the thoughts of the women of 124. Unspeakable thoughts, unspoken. And when I hear that, I think repressed, right? Things that are too frightening to speak. So these next chapters after the section I just read, they all begin with a description of some relationship to Beloved. Beloved, she my daughter, she mine. Beloved is my sister. I swallowed her blood right along with my mother's milk. Then I am beloved and she is mine. 2 chapters begin with I am beloved and she is mine. So I think at this point it's clear that this figure of Beloved is more than just a ghost. It is more than just her baby come back from the dead. Beloved is related to those voices around 124 Bluestone Road. She is the embodiment of that past or of those painful memories. Now that she's back, Setha, remember, does not have to remember anymore. And she's relieved. Beloved is a part of what I think of what Morrison calls the jungle white folks planted in them. And this is on page 234, just before the end of this section. And it reads, white people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle, swift, unnavigable waters, etc. I'm going to skip ahead. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them to this place from the other livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them. And it grew. It spread. In, through, and after life, it spread, until it invaded the whites who had made it, touched them every one, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. So the fact that the novel switches from Stamp Pade's perspective of unspeakable thoughts around 124 Bluestone Road, and then to the chapters devoted to describing relationships with Beloved, this tells us that she is somehow a part of all of these characters, and somehow related to this jungle that white folks planted in them. So these last two chapters that begin, I am beloved and she is mine, or the last two chapters for our reading this week, they seem to be from Beloved's point of view. Or are they? So in this hallucinatory array of images and conversations that make up those two chapters, it seems like this perspective reaches all the way back to the middle passage, to the experience of being in that crowded boat, being transported from Africa to the New World. So, in this upcoming discussion board, you guys have some hard questions to answer. First, tell me, why do you think Setha killed her baby? What drove her to do it? The narrative says that she saw a hat and split to the shed to kill her children. Then, what do you think happens to Setha when they return from ice skating? Something clicks. In the book it says, it was then, when Beloved finished humming, that Setha recalled the click, the settling of pieces into places designed and made especially for them. End quote. So, what does Setha realize? I mentioned this, what I thought earlier. I want to know what you think. What does Setha realize? How would you characterize her change in perspective, especially toward Beloved? Then, explain to me why that ribbon is so important to Stamp Pade. Why does he carry it around with him? What does it mean to him? What does it represent? Then, tell me about what we learn how am I going to say this? What we learn, tell me what we learn about the figure of Beloved from these last 4 chapters. The I am beloved and she is mine, or Beloved is my daughter and she is mine, etc. What do we learn about Beloved? Meaning, what do we learn about the figure of Beloved? What does she represent? She's not just a ghost, right? What is she? What do you make of these chapters that begin, I am beloved and she is mine? So, I look forward to reading your thoughts on these 4, especially on these 4 cryptic chapters about the figure of Beloved. She is more than a ghost. What is she? Remember, my office hours are for you guys to talk with me about the reading. If something is confusing or unclear, please write me an email. I would love to hear from you.